And I do want to switch gears. And I do want to talk about what was unquestionably the single most interesting result that came out of Saturday in college football, Wasn't the biggest result. Biggest result was obviously, look, it was Oklahoma losing to Baylor. What does it mean for Oklahoma? What does it mean for the playoff picture? What does it mean for the Big 12 picture? What does it mean, by the way, maybe for the Heisman race with Caleb Williams? That was the biggest result of the weekend. I would argue Texas A&M losing was probably number 2. Somewhere after that, Michigan surviving against Penn State, Ohio, whatever. Doesn't really matter. Those were the biggest results of the weekend. Yet the most interesting result, unquestionably, came from Austin, Texas, where the Texas Longhorns came into Saturday on a 4-game losing streak, trying to avoid their first 5-game losing streak since 1956. The good news, they had Kansas. Kansas, the Big 12's whipping boy in football. Basketball, they're awesome. But the Big 12's whipping boy in football. Kansas is coming to town. There's no way Texas can lose to Kansas, right? 30.5-point favorite, no doubt. They might not cover the spread, but they'll crush Kansas. Instead, what happened? Kansas comes into Austin. Kansas comes into Darrell Royal Stadium. Final score in overtime, 57-56. Kansas gets the win in one of the most shocking upsets of the season. And what was crazy was it was live in the Fox Sports Radio studios while I was doing my radio show. There was nothing fluky about this game. It's not like there was bad weather, there was a million turnovers, there was a bunch of crazy injuries. Kansas actually led 35-14 at the half. They were up 3 touchdowns at halftime. Texas had to rally just to force overtime. Texas had to rally and score a touchdown in the final minute to get it to overtime. On top of that, even in overtime, Kansas had to convert a 2-point conversion to win in the first overtime. So it is crazy. It is unbelievable. And a Kansas team, which has been a whipping boy for the Big 12 for the better part of 15 years, just went into Texas and got the win. Okay? First of all, to even contextualize how big this is, I know Texas has been bad forever. They haven't been this bad. And some of the stats I'm going to tell you will absolutely blow you away. Kansas coming into this game was 3 and in their last 62, let me just put it this way, because I'm going to trip up my numbers and I'm going to yell and scream and get mad at myself. In their last 62 games coming into this game, Kansas, was 3-59 in their last 62 Big 12 games. They are now 4-59. So just think about that. 3-59 in their last 62 Big 12 games. We play 9 games a year. You do the math. That's about 8.5 seasons. 3-59, and they just got a win. This is only their 4th win in 63 Big 12 matchups. Here's the crazy part, though. Of those 4 wins, 2 of them have come against Texas. That's right. Don't forget, Charlie Strong, the loss that basically torpedoed and ended the Charlie Strong era at Texas, was a loss at Kansas. So Kansas, which has 4 total Big 12 wins in their last 63 Big 12 games, 2 of them are against Texas. On top of that, here's another stat for you. Since 2010, Kansas has only beaten 2 teams multiple times. Texas is one. Central Michigan is the other. How about this? And this one was the one that really kind of blew me away. Kansas has not won a Big 12 road game since, are you ready for this? They've not won a Big 12 road game. Listen to what I'm about to say. They have not won a Big 12 road game since 2008. We're talking 13 years. We are talking, it is so long ago, it was the George Bush administration. George W. Bush was the president the last time Kansas won a Big 12 road game. It was so long ago, Nick Saban has won 6 national championships. Great stat via Matt Brown from The Athletic. 6 national championships Nick Saban has won since Kansas won a Big 12 road game, and they just did it on Saturday night in Darrell Royal Stadium. And here's the crazy part to me, okay? This is the part that truly blows my mind, truly boggles my mind. It is the fact that, yes, it's Texas, and you should never lose to Kansas. But this Texas team specifically should never lose to this Kansas team for one simple reason, okay? Let's talk about Kansas for half a second. Lance Leipold's doing an incredible job. But this is not a Kansas team that is in year 3 or year 4 of a rebuild and they're starting to show a little bit of life. I know they played well against Oklahoma the other day. Kansas, never forget, actually has a less longer tenured head coach than Steve Sarkisian. Steve Sarkisian has been the head coach at Texas longer than Lance Leipold has been the head coach at Kansas. Kansas, of course, was coached by Les Miles. He gets in trouble. He's being a creep. He's texting and talking inappropriately to girls in the office, in the workspace, whatever. He gets fired in March. Lance Leipold does not take over until April 30th. So Kansas did not have a football coach until April of this year. Most of their best players hit the portal. He didn't get to go through spring practice, and he still went to their Royal Stadium and got the win. I mean, you're talking about just insanity. And I know we love to poke at Texas, but this is absolute insanity. And so with it, I've done enough kind of setting up, enough foreplay, if you will. Wink, wink, nod, nod. Let's just talk about the game itself. And 4 things really come to mind when I'm thinking about this loss for Texas from the Texas perspective, because I think that's the question, right? How do they continue to hit new lows? How do they continue to hit rock bottom? How does it continue to get so bad? And I have 4 thoughts on that. 1, let's just stop with the fire Sark stuff. Like I don't know if Sark's the guy. 10 games in, we got to stop with the fire Sark stuff. 2, I would also say, can we stop blaming the players? And to be clear, I know what happened this week. I know that one of these knucklehead, excuse my language, but craphead, shithead, whatever you want to call it, one of these shithead players recorded Bo Davis screaming and yelling at them. And I had no problem with Bo Davis doing it. I actually like that Steve Sarkisian stood up for his coach. But I am so tired of all of these Texas coaches complaining about the players. The last 3 head coaches, Charlie Strong, Tom Herman, Steve Sarkisian, it's the same excuse when they come in. Well, the culture's terrible. Well, we got kids that don't love football. We got kids that are all focused on the stars and the wrong thing. It can't always be the players, okay? First of all, if that was the problem in the Mac Brown era, then you would think that Charlie Strong fixed it by recruiting the right kids. If Charlie Strong didn't fix it, you would think that Tom Herman fixed it by recruiting the right kids. If he didn't fix it, Steve Sarkisian, you got to figure it out, okay? Because you go back across college football, it shouldn't be this bad, and you cannot blame it on the players. Nick Saban, yes, he struggled in year 1. In year 2, he had Alabama at number 1 in the country. Urban Meyer, you can criticize Urban Meyer for a lot. He doesn't blame the players when things go bad. Remember the story that Joshua Perry, Big Ten Network, told on this podcast. He said that when Urban Meyer walked in, first day of practice or whatever it was, and I'm paraphrasing Josh Perry, you can go back and listen to the interview, but he said it on this podcast, so it's not like I'm keeping state secrets here. He told Josh Perry, he said, you're not good enough to play for me. I would have never recruited you if I had the opportunity. But you know what? You're here now. Let's make it work. And I don't know if Urban Meyer was saying it because he wanted him to transfer, because he was really hoping that he wasn't going to play, whether he was being honest, whether he was trying to motivate him. But here's the truth. Urban Meyer took that same player that he told he would not recruit. He had him for 4 years in the program. He was a key part of winning a national championship. Urban Meyer made it work. Urban Meyer went 12-0 in his first year at Ohio State. You can't keep blaming the players for everything. Number 3, what I would also say, and I think these last 2 are kind of corresponding, I think it's time to admit Tom Herman wasn't the problem. I think 2 things in life. What do I always say? 2 things in life can be true. 2 things in life can be true. And I think with Tom Herman, 2 things can be true. I don't think he was the guy to bring Texas back. I don't think he was the long-term answer. I actually talked about it when he was fired, but interesting story. Taylor Estes, who covers this team as well as anybody covers the Texas Longhorns, she came on my radio show, and she talked about how Tom Herman had lost touch with the players. He wasn't saying he was walking past them in the facility without making eye contact. He was aloof. And I'm not saying that he was the right answer at Texas, but he was not the biggest problem at Texas, okay? Last year, Tom Herman went 7-3. I don't think people like Tom Herman wasn't bad last year. And of the they go 7-3. Keep in mind they didn't even play Kansas. So if they had played Kansas, they would have been 8-3 because Kansas was terrible last year under Les Miles. They would have gone 8-3. If they had played a regular out-of-conference schedule, at worst we're talking about a 9-3 type team. What I would also say is of the 7-3 record, like we think of Tom Herman as this absolute train wreck disaster. 7-3 last year. In a COVID year, no spring practice, no nothing. And it's also worth mentioning, the 3 losses, loses to Oklahoma in double overtime, loses to TCU by 2, loses to Iowa State by 3. Easily could have been 8-1, what would it be, 9-1 or 8-2 in a COVID year. I'm not saying Tom Herman was the answer. but he is not as big of a problem as people give him credit for. Don't know that I would have kept him. Don't know if Steve Sarkisian is going to be better or worse, but we got to stop blaming all these coaches. We are now on the third coach since Mac Brown. We got to stop blaming the coaches. And I'm going to tell you what the single biggest problem with Texas football is right now. It's not Steve Sarkisian. It's not the players. It wasn't Tom Herman. You know what the single biggest problem with Texas football is right now? It's the fans and it's the fan base. And it sounds mean and it sounds terrible, but I'm just going to say it. And if you want to get mad at me, Texas fans, you want to threaten me, you want to say mean things in the YouTube comment section, whatever. I'm just going to tell you the truth. You guys are the biggest problem, and you guys need to back off and let the football people do the football stuff. Like Tom Herman. I'm not saying Steve Sarkisian is the definitive answer, but the idea that we have any idea or proof after 10 games is absolutely insane. You have to let Steve Sarkisian do his job. You have to let his coordinators do what they were paid some of the biggest salaries in college football to do. You cannot keep shaking up this coaching staff. You cannot keep demanding new head coaches. You cannot keep demanding that those head coaches shake up their assistant coaching staffs. You cannot do it. You have to let the program build some continuity. You have to let the program develop under a head coach. You have to let the assistants develop under the head coach. You have to let the players develop in the schemes of the system, of the assistant coaches as well. You cannot keep shaking this up because this is the problem, and this is why you're here, is that every 6 months, every year, you want to reshake this thing and roll the dice again, and at some point you got to stop. And I think this is something that is really interesting to me in college football, that I think we might see a little bit of a regression in the next few years, is I think we have been so quick to fire everybody that I think sometimes at some point these administrators are going to learn we just have to bite the bullet, we just have to deal with it, and we have to give a guy enough time to figure out if he or she, not he or she, he is the answer or not. I'll give you an example. Florida State. Florida State is basically Texas of the Southeast, Texas of the Panhandle. Jimbo Fisher leaves. The program was declining when he was there. I will not deny that. They bring in Willie Taggart for a year and a half, don't give him a fair shot, fire him by the end of year 2. Then they bring in Mike Norvell. Last year was a disaster. It was a COVID year. They start, 0-4 this year, I believe, was what they started at. And everybody wanted Mike Norvell gone. And it's like, at some point, you just got to let the guy coach. And to Mike Norvell's credit, I think they've actually been pretty good. They started 0-4, but you lose to Notre Dame by 3. You lose to Jacksonville State on the final play of the game, not excusable. And you lose to a good Wake Forest team that we didn't know was good at the time. Since that 0-4 loss, 0-4 start, they're 4-2. And I would say, overall, they are 4-2 in games where their starting quarterback, Jordan Travis, is fully healthy. And so I know I'm going off the reservation here talking about Florida State as opposed to Texas. But if you're Texas, at some point you just have to back off. At some point you just have to give somebody a little bit of breathing room. You have to allow them to make mistakes. You have to allow them to learn on the job. And you have to allow them to grow and evolve on the job. I'll say this. I talked about it on the show last week. I give Nebraska a ton of credit. I don't know if Scott Frost is really the answer. I think some of the mistakes should have been corrected at this point, but to be this close, to be right on the cusp at Nebraska of almost beating Ohio State, almost beating Michigan, almost beating Oklahoma, almost beating Michigan State, at some point you just have to let a coach do his job and really know. And so Nebraska, rather than reshaking things up and starting over from scratch when the foundation is already built, they're giving Scott Frost one more year to be like, okay, is it really the players? Is it really the scheme? Is it really just we can't get over the hump? Or are you the problem? By the end of next year, we're going to know if Scott Frost is the problem or not, and we're going to let him go. And it's the same with Texas right now. And I know nobody realistically thinks Steve Sarkisian is going to get fired this year. But what I do think I'm already hearing is you got to change the defensive staff. You got to do this. You got to do that. I'm not saying that Pete Kwiatkowski, the defensive coordinator, is the definitive. I'm not saying he's Mike Elko. I'm not saying he's Nick Saban. I'm not saying he's Kirby Smart. I'm not saying he's the best answer. But what I am saying is this. I hope Steve Sarkisian holds his ground. I hope if he believes that he has the right coaches on his staff that he's going to let them do their jobs. And I will give him credit. He stood by Bo Davis last week, and I'll be curious to see what happens this offseason. Because right now, Texas is at 4-6. They just lost to Kansas. They've lost their first. They're on their first 5-game losing streak since 1956. And what I would finally say is they're going to have to beat West Virginia, and they're going to have to beat Kansas State to go to a bowl game. And so whether they go to a bowl game or not, 6-6 we know is not acceptable in Austin. And I'm curious if he stands by his coaches. I'm curious if he makes change, because if he starts making change, that whole cycle just starts all over again, and maybe we see ourselves in a situation like we've seen Texas over the last couple of years. Again, I'm not saying Steve Sarkisian is definitively the answer. I'm not saying there aren't problems internally. But stop blaming the coaches and stop demanding that the coaching staff gets shaken up every 2 or 3 months. That is not the right answer in college football. If you enjoyed this video, do me a quick favor. Make sure to subscribe to the Aaron Torres Podcast YouTube channel. Also, make sure you're following on social media at Aaron_Torres on Twitter, at Aaron Torres Pod on Instagram.